Hello. So in this video, I want to talk about the theory of cultural relativism, which is an ethical or really meta-ethical, though we'll talk in another video about what the distinction between ethics and meta-ethics means. In any case, meta-ethical theory, according to which the truth of ethical or moral claims depends entirely on the norms of one's culture. Um, so, cultural relativism is a non objectivist theory of ethics. Cultural relativists do not think that um, what's morally right or wrong is an objective fact about the world. Rather, what's morally right or wrong depends on the norms that people subjectively accept kind of collectively within one's culture. And so I'll also say here that the focus on in this video on my general like overview discussion of and evaluation of cultural relativism will focus on the evaluation provided by Rachel's and Rachel's. I'll cite their paper down in the description. So I'll walk through their discussion here. So Rachel's begin by noting an obvious fact about our world. Different cultures have different moral codes. That much seems clear. Okay. So for example, the Galatians cooked and ate the bodies of their dead fathers, while the Greeks practiced cremation. People from both cultures expressed shock at the thought of partaking in the practices of the other culture. So yeah, different moral codes. Not just do different cultures or people within different cultures do different things. There are practices where people in one culture view it as morally bad, even though it's viewed as quite normal in some other culture. So this so far is just sort of a sociological observation. Likewise, there's a significant difference between the cultural practices of the Eskimo people and those of our own society. While most people in our society regard infanticide, that is, killing infants, as immoral, this is, or at least was, a common practice among the Eskimo people. At least Rachel's and Rachel's claim so. Okay, cultural disagreement about moral codes. That seems like something that obviously does occur across cultures, at least to some extent. But now, as Rachel's go on to note, this observation, that is, the observation of cross cultural moral disagreement, has led some people to the further claim that there are no objective or universal moral truths. Rather, morality depends entirely on the norms of one's culture. This is the view known as cultural relativism. So here's one argument that one might give for that view, that is for cultural relativism. Rachel's consider this one. So premise one, different cultures have different moral codes. Conclusion, therefore, from one, there is no objective truth in morality. Right and wrong are only matters of opinion, and opinions vary from culture to culture. Now, you may notice that there seems to be a problem with this argument. Namely, the premise and the conclusion do not have the right sort of relation to justify or show that the conclusion really follows from the premise. Um, Rachel's, in evaluating this argument, say so themselves. They claim that the argument is invalid and hence unsound. And it's invalid because it does not have the right relation between the conclusion and the premise. And this is because the conclusion does not follow from the argument's single premise. In order for an argument to be valid, it has to be the case that it's impossible for all of its premises to be true while its conclusion is false. But that does not seem to be the case here, as Rachel's point out. The reason for this is that the premise of this argument simply says something about what people believe, whereas the conclusion says something about what is really the case. Um, to see the problem, consider a scientific analogy. There's cross cultural disagreement about whether the earth is round, but this does not entail that there is no fact about the matter. In fact, many people think that there is a fact about the matter, that the earth is round, even if there are a number of cultures, whether now or in the past or both, that disagreed with this. There might be cross cultural disagreement about what people think is in fact true, but this doesn't entail that there's not actually a fact about the matter. And we might think for independent reasons that there's no fact about the matter for morality, but it doesn't seem like it follows from this alone. Um, so okay, doesn't seem like that's a good argument, but nevertheless, there might be plenty of other arguments perhaps for the theory, or we might just evaluate like what would follow from the theory if it were true. And Rachel's lay out three consequences that they take to follow from cultural relativism. So one, um, we could no longer say that the customs of other societies are morally inferior to our own. This would be because are any customs are only good or bad relative to the society that practices them or accepts them. So we might have our customs, another society has theirs. Relative to us, our customs are good, and relative to them, their customs might be good, and theirs might be bad relative to the standards of our society. But we can't really say that they're morally inferior to our own because within their society, they're good. Um, we could also no longer criticize the code of our own society, at least not unless it's a case where our society's code is inconsistent with itself. So we might be able to criticize the code of our own society in cases where maybe like our society in general values one thing and some other thing that our society in general values seems to conflict with that. We might be able to say there, well, like by our own standards, we're being inconsistent because we're valuing one thing and this contradictory thing. But say we are consistent, we're just all accepting, or our society in general accepts some standard or value that might seem bad to us. So long as we're consistent, we can't say like, well, our society, its values could have been better, because really what makes our society's values good in the first place is just whether or not they're accepted by our society. So we couldn't really criticize the code of our own society in any cases where it's not simply a matter of us being inconsistent about the standards that we already accept in our society. Third, we can no longer make sense of the idea of moral progress. And this is because all we'd really have here would be moral change. We might imagine that, well, okay, so in the past, for example, in the US, we had a society where slavery was considered quite normal. Most people nowadays might think that, and probably would want to say that, yeah, we progressed quite a bit to no longer accept that. Most of us think that that was quite bad. Um, and we've made moral progress, we might say. But we can't, it's not clear that we can really say that if cultural relativism is true, because in the past, the codes of our society were such that slavery was genuinely fine because it was based on the customs that our society accepted. It might be bad now, but we didn't really have progress, just change. We had different standards that our society accepts, and so different things were deemed good or bad. And it is worth saying briefly that for all three of those consequences, Rachel's think that, well, they're not super appealing or great consequences. So it does seem like there are downsides, they want to say, to accepting cultural relativism. In addition to the argument considered earlier being invalid, even if we provide some alternative motivation for cultural relativism. Nevertheless, Rachel seem to think that, well, it seems maybe problematic as a theory on the whole, given that there are those rather hard to accept consequences. But they also go on now to discuss, to maybe try to cast some doubt on cultural relativism or other motivations for it in the first place. For example, by trying to cast doubt on whether there really is that much cross-cultural disagreement, moral disagreement in the first place. So they claim that there's not really, or there might not really be as much cross-cultural moral disagreement as it might initially seem that there is. And the reason for this is that some seemingly significant moral disagreements might actually be disagreements about non-moral facts and or differences in what circumstances require rather than genuine moral disagreements. So further, they suggest that there are certain things that all cultures accept and must accept in order to survive, such as a value placed on honesty and a prohibition on murder. Um, so I guess I'll briefly say a little bit more about both of these 2 points here. So for the first one, they point out, for example, that the disagreement or seeming disagreement between most of our cultures in the contemporary West, I suppose, that they're talking about, and then the Eskimo people, which seems to be different. It's in disagreement on about whether infanticide is morally permissible, might actually boil down to a disagreement about non-moral facts or differences in what circumstances require. So they say that, well, in the case of the Eskimo people, it actually seems that it wasn't as though they simply thought that infanticide was just fine and that they were willing to do it whenever with no qualms. It was rather that they needed restrictions on population to survive. They also did not have birth control like many people in the contemporary West. And so given these things, which might amount to both disagreements about the non-moral facts, that is, about like what it might take for them to survive. Maybe they had disagreements about like what's required for survival and we didn't. And then there might also be legitimately legitimate differences in their actual circumstances and what they required for survival as opposed to ours. And so it might really be these things that um, resulted in the discrepancy between the practices of infanticide rather than simply a moral disagreement about whether or not infanticide is good or bad or permissible or impermissible. For and additionally, Rachel's and Rachel's say that like, well, look, imagine that we have some society that does not value honesty or a prohibition on murder at all. Seems very hard that those people in that society would be able to cooperate and survive long term. So it seems like there's some basic values like this that really maybe all cultures will need to accept in order to persist as cultures and maybe even come together in the first place. And so without that, we wouldn't have like a lasting culture if we even had one to begin with. And so, for all cultures that exist, at least that continue to exist beyond a really short duration of time, it might be the case that really they're not um, cross cultural disagreement about all things. There might be some fundamental values that all cultures have to accept. Um, and this kind of leads into Rachel's suggesting that we could find a cross culture moral standard, or in other words, we could find a culture independent moral standard, one that all cultures could accept, that all cultures might think is right, and so one that's not relative to any specific culture. So they suggest the following. They suggest that welfare seems like a standard that um, could be accepted by all cultures and also could be at work in motivating the differences that we've already seen and talked about between different cultures so far. It might be the case that based on circumstances, things different things are required to promote welfare within different cultures, and it might also be the case that different cultures have different like psychological views about what does promote welfare. But nevertheless, they might all ultimately accept that promoting welfare is good and that their culture should largely revolve around that. And they might even and even if they don't already accept that, it might be the case that that could be a rather neutral standard that most of them could accept. But it's also worth noting here that other moral theorists have provided other answers. So even if you are or one is tempted to think that yeah, we could find a culture independent moral standard, it need not be welfare; it might be something else. Um, Now, before concluding, Rachel's return to why one might, in light of everything, or despite everything that's been said, still kind of find cultural relativism appealing. And one reason for this is that one might feel sort of a reluctance to criticize other cultures. There might be three reasons for this. Rachel's claim that these are three reasons that people are at least often reluctant to criticize other cultures. So one is that people are nervous to interfere with other cultures. They might want to not feel, or maybe have reason not to do that and think that, yeah, we should kind of let cultures do their own thing, at least to a large extent. Second, people might think that, well, we should be tolerant of other cultures. We should kind of, at least to some extent, respect their right to sort of accept certain practices and standards of their own. And lastly, we might think that, well, we don't want to express contempt for other cultures. We don't want to kind of dismiss them and think that, oh, they're bad people or bad culture because of some standard that they have that's different than one that we accept. And so, for these reasons, people might be kind of tempted in the direction of cultural relativism. Um, but Rachel's claim that all three of them are actually compatible with rejecting cultural relativism. We might think that, well, even if there's some culture independent standard of morality that makes things right or wrong, even if some other culture is doing things wrong and we're doing things right, maybe there's other reasons that we shouldn't just interfere with them. Maybe we should let them make their own mistakes, even if they're genuinely mistakes. We might also think that it's valuable to be tolerant of others and do not express contempt for them, even again if they're doing something legitimately wrong. And so it doesn't seem Rachel's think that in order to accept any of these motivations, we actually need to accept cultural relativism. We could take all of these motivations on board and say, yeah, we value all three of these things, or we're committed to all three of these things, but we nevertheless do not have to be cultural relativists. Okay, so that brings me to the end of what I want to cover in this video. I hope this has been kind of a helpful overview and summary of cultural relativism and the discussion of it provided by Rachel's.